Hello everybody. I'm giving another talk again today. This particular one is quite different from anything that I presented before, really quite far removed from what I thought were my major interests. Today we're going to be talking about Spencer House, a palatial, very old home located in London, where it came from, who built it, who lived there, and how it has figured into history. So you can see it's far removed from things I've talked about before, you know, diabetes and viruses and respiration and the Great Lakes most recently. So this is a very, very different kind of talk. Today's talk is going to be about a splendid 18th century townhouse that you see on the screen right now that still exists in London, England. It's called Spencer House. It was built during the decade from 1756 to 1766, about a 10-year period, as you can see, just before our American Revolutionary War. Just to get it in context for you, it is still owned by the modern day descendants of that original builder, which is remarkable. That fellow's name was John Spencer, and he was the first Earl Spencer, sort of a name indicating prestige and wealth endowed by the king. He was in turn a man who is a descendant from even earlier Spencers. We can track the Spencers back all the way to 1066, the Norman Conquest, and there the record can even be further tracked back in England. So we're dealing with people of a very long lineage, and we're looking at a man named John Spencer, who lived during our American Revolutionary War. From the very beginning of its construction in 1756, this private palace, I'm going to call it that from now on, or I'm going to call it a palace home, was considered to be one of the most ambitious projects ever undertaken for private palaces in London, and there were a number of them. Most are gone today, but this one survives right up to now. And there's one more, Buckingham Palace. Now, when I say Buckingham Palace, I'm talking about just that central piece that you see in the pictures, all the extended wings. That's more modern part of the palace, but it would have been a building quite similar to what you see here on the screen. This house, this home, incredibly, is still in use today. But the last Spencers of the Spencer family lineage, the last ones to live here, moved out in 1926, but the house still belongs to the Spencer estate. Today, it's used for conferences, it's used for banquets, various and assorted official receptions, parties, recitals, weddings. If you're going to afford to have a party there, you can go to Spencer House, maybe. The house itself is still owned by the Spencer family, but as I said, not lived in since 1926. However, most recently it has been leased for 125 years, if you can imagine such a thing, by a Lord Rothschild, who's a British peer, an investment banker, and a prominent member of English society. And it's rumored that he actually spends time in the house living there. I'm not sure about that. But he has taken on the formidable task of restoration, of modernization, and the preservation of this incredible building. I want to share with you a few pictures of this magnificent building, home, and I want to try and put it into some kind of a meaningful context for you. Maybe some of you have seen it on a visit to London. I visited London, but I never knew this was there. But I suspect that most of you have not seen it. So here it goes. On our second slide, which Mikey today is going to, well, I am. There we are. Who were the people who built Spencer House? Well, they're the people who live in this palace in an estate area called Althorp, which is, I think, about 40 miles out of London. And this dates back all the way into the Middle Ages when, well, think Downton Abbey if you want to. That was the end of that system, that manorial system. And these people owned thousands of acres, which was farmed by their serfs or their peasants. And these people, the lords and the ladies of this land, lived in places like this. You saw the Downton Abbey representation. Well, this is another real one at Althorp Estate. The town is Althorp. And these people during these early ages and the Middle Ages would own not only thousands of acres of land, but also would build these fabulous houses, and they'd own the little towns and hamlets, all went with the parcel, including all the peasants and the serfs living in their huts, doing the farming, doing the work for the lord and the lady of the manor. This is still the home and headquarters of today's Spencer family. On our next slide, slide 3, oh yeah, Mikey tells me I got to do it myself. This is the original architect's drawing of Spencer House. So it dates back to, about in the 1740s, 45, 50, somewhere in there. And this is, I think, possibly the so-called front to St. James Park. That is to say, it fronts on St. James Park, but this would be, I believe, the west exposure of the house. And as you'll see in pictures, it's virtually unchanged even till today. So who was this person? Who was this fellow, this first Lord Spencer? Let's just see if we can dig a little into his history and get some feeling, because he was a very interesting character. John Spencer was born into an aristocratic family, and thus he was privileged. He was, for example, the great-grandson of Lady Sarah, who was the Duchess of Marlborough, which means nothing to us. He was the grandson of the 3rd Earl of Sunderland, which means nothing to us, but it indicates a lineage and a relationship which would certainly be beneficial to John Spencer, both in terms of his lifestyle and his wealth and his ability to do precisely what he wanted to do. This house gave him prestige and privilege in the London environment. Actually, that Spencer family, dating all those centuries ago, still with us today. We're currently up to the 9th Earl Spencer. John, our topic for today, was the 1st Earl Spencer. Our 9th Earl Spencer has the name of Charles Edward Maurice Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer, and he is the brother, as some of you know, of Princess Diana, who's buried on the Althorpe property. So this figures into her life also. I doubt that she ever lived here, but she certainly knew of this, and she certainly visited here. Okay, so the question comes up. Why did the palace home get built in the first place? What was the motivation? Was it to be near the seat of power? Was it to hobnob with the rich and the powerful? Was it to have a physical presence in a desirable location in London? We don't know the reason, but it certainly was almost a compulsion that the family must have deeply felt in order to have used the money and the effort, nearly 10 years of effort, in building this palace home. I want to try and put this in a framework for you in terms of world history, so you know the era that we're talking about. What came from, were these people, who were they, and what did they do, and what was their life like? Actually, during the 1760s and the 1770s, there was a world war going on. We don't recognize it as such, but historians do. Really the first world war in history. And it impacted the American colonies in a very significant way. The war was between the French and the British. American colonists called it the French and Indian War because the French, for 2 centuries, had been living in upper parts of Canada. They had befriended thousands of Indians, and together, we call the French and Indian War, attacked the colonies south of the Canadian border. And so the colonists asked the British, who were running these colonies, to come and help them, and they did. They sent troops to the American colonies, they sent the Navy to the American ports, and the war, the so-called French and Indian War, continued on the North American continent. But it was a world war, it was all over the place. So, even at one point, another one of our heroes, George Washington, at the age of 20, served in the British Army on that war right here in North America. It's where he got much of his army training during that particular war in trying to preserve and protect the so-called Ohio Territory from the French, from Quebec and places in Canada. So that's where the name of the war comes from. That would have been about 1754. 1754, why, that was just the year before John Spencer and Georgiana Poinitz married. She had a lot of money in her own bank account, as it were. She was independently wealthy. And they married in 1755, and they were the couple who built this house. So I'm wandering a little bit, but I'm trying to pick up for you a little bit of the history so you can put this house in some kind of context. In the next slide, we have a picture of John Spencer. This is the guy who started it all. I mean, he lived in that house, but he built that mansion in London. Born 1734, died 1783. That was the year the American Revolution ended. That was the Peace Treaty of Paris was going on, and that was the year he died. Quite young, in his 40s, late 40s. So he didn't live very long to enjoy his palatial home in London. On the next slide, I want to try again. I'm trying to put it in historical context for you so you can have a sense of the time period. And this painting pretty much tells the story. It's a strange painting. It's a Benjamin West painting. He did it in 1783, and it's supposed to show the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which would end the American Revolution. The people in that painting, from left to right, standing there on the left, looking very solemn and very pompous, is John Jay, America's leading diplomat. Seated in front of him, John Adams, who would become our second president. Seated to his left in a black vest, you can see him, I think you all know who he is, Benjamin Franklin. Standing behind him, someone we hardly know, a guy named Henry Loren. He was one of the people who negotiated the final peace treaty, and then seated in front of him is none other than William Franklin. Why, it's none other than Ben Franklin's son. I guess he took the opportunity to take the young man to Paris to see the sights. Those are the people who were alive at the time of the period that we're talking about. All of these people would have been doing their thing during this time interval. It's an interesting perspective, I think, and certainly our hero, whom you saw in a previous slide, John Spencer, he would have known all about these events. Surely in that home that they built in London, they would sit around the dinner table talking about these world events, which were so important at that time. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on so we can look at the house in more detail. And I think that our next slide will take us to the foyer of the home. We've come in the front entrance off St. James Place, and we've entered, and this is the vestibulum. This is the foyer, just beyond the main entrance. Take a look at that picture. If that isn't designed to make you wonder, whoa, there's a lot of wealth here. That statue at the far end, right in front of the window, is of the Roman Emperor Lucius Verus. I have to tell you that our hero today, the man who built this home, John Spencer, loved everything Roman. This was the time when England and worldwide archaeologists were just beginning to excavate the ancient Roman ruins. And John Spencer had the money to buy what he wanted of those ruins, and that statue you see down there is one of them. I have no idea what he paid for that. You couldn't do that today, but you could in those days. So that statue down there is of one of the Roman emperors. And then look over the fireplace. You see another one. This is the famous Roman Emperor Antoninus, who had recently been discovered as the statuary from the Emperor Hadrian's home in ancient Rome. Hadrian, you may remember, was the emperor who built the wall across northern England to keep those northern barbarians from invading all the time. Maybe some of you in your travels to Britain have even walked on parts of that wall. I've only seen pictures of it, but this is the man who was involved in doing that. I think really a classically trained architect could write a book on just that foyer alone. The artwork that's in it, just incredibly precious. The construction, look at the ceilings. Look at the lantern, the lights in the ceilings. So it's awesome. It certainly was meant to be awesome for visitors. But what I'm going to do now is we're going to move into the dining room. And our next slide is going to show that. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry about that. Here's the architect's design for the dining room. The architect was a very famous architect at the time, John Vardy. And during the war, parts of this room were damaged by German bombing, but they've all been restored to their original elegance. The pillars, for example, the frieze that you see up and around the ceiling, all of this copied from Roman ruins, which both John and his wife just loved that kind of thing. Look at the Roman table. I don't mean it was made in Rome at the time of Rome, but copied. At the far end, there are two lamps just in front of it. It's a magnificent table. Get a close-up in just a few moments. The fireplace, it's all white marble. Every fireplace in this place was white marble. All of it has been taken out and taken to the country home in 1939 to preserve that exquisite artwork from German bombs, which were sure to come. If you look carefully at the pictures above the fireplace, now there's some reflection of the lighting on the picture, but that's the great battles of the French and Indian War, which was fought in Quebec on the fields of Abraham, and shows the death of the British general. So that you can see the kind of artwork that was incorporated into this room. Much of the frieze work along the ceilings of the dining room, and indeed much of the house, was copied from this kind of representation you see here. This is a picture of the Temple of Fortuna Virilis in Rome as it would have appeared in 40 BC. It's really the best preserved of all the ancient Roman temples. And if you look at the top of the pillars, you see the frieze, which was the inspiration for the architect to do the work that he did in the dining room and indeed other rooms of the house. And on the left-hand side of the picture, you can see that enlarged, so you get some more of the detail in the picture. So this is the Roman temple of Fortuna Virilis. I'm going to go back now to the table. I think, yes, this is the leg of the table. The table I showed you way in the distance. There are two of which are in this room. You can see the very top of the picture is the marble top of the table. But this is the leg that you see here. And what an interesting study it makes. The whole thing is gilded, as you can see. And the whole thing was designed actually by the architect who designed the house. These date to about 1758. And the thing about the furniture and I guess it was true at that time in many homes, that the tables featured, well, things like this panther. But look at the panther carefully. It has wings. Well, panthers don't have wings. Where did that idea come from? And look at the face. It almost has a humanoid quality about it. And many of the sculptures and the carvings with animals like lions and tigers have a sort of humanoid quality. I don't know where that comes from. It's a strange thing, and you'll see examples of it as we go along. But the interesting thing about these two tables is that both of them, after the death of John and Georgiana, both of them were sold by the son who became the next owner of the home. They were sold and they ended up in Holland. And years later, Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert went to Holland, rebought the tables, and returned them to the home to where they were originally, and they are there today. Kind of an interesting story involving Elizabeth. I don't know much more about it than that. Here's another view of the dining room. Actually, today it's arranged for a program. But you'll notice as you look at this other end of the dining room, it's the same, it's a mirror image of the opposite side, which you saw before with the dining room table. Two pillars with Roman, Greek pillar engravings and frieze work, all copied from these ancient Roman temples, and two doors entering the room. And notice the chairs, not originals. My guess is somebody's going to give a talk, or maybe there's going to be a violin quartet playing there. We don't know. It's used for these purposes, and that's for the audience to sit and look at it. Evidently, there are musical programs today, talks, so forth, all the time in this beautiful home, and this well may be one of them, but it was the original dining room. You're seeing half of it. Well, dinner's over in the dining room, and as it was in those days, the ladies would adjourn through the room upstairs, which happened to be Georgiana's private quarters. And the men, they'd cross the hall and have a little chat, probably with cigars or the equivalent, and they'd sit right there in that room called the palm room. That room is considered possibly to be the architectural climax of the ground floor. Many people consider it one of the most beautiful rooms in all of England, but as you can imagine, there's controversy about that. Anyway, look at the pillars, look at the gilded palm leaves and trees. Look at the statuary in there, inset in alcoves. What a magnificent room. And I'm going to show you the ceiling of that room. But I'll tell you a little story first about the room. A very controversial room. You'd be astonished at why there was controversy. People who would visit would stand and look at the room and say, well, it looks just like the king's bedchamber at Greenwich Palace. Palm trees, which were symbolic of fertility in those years. That's a copy of the king's. To which Georgiana said, no, it wasn't. She did it on her own, and besides, she said, if it were a bedchamber, would she ever have put a window in it? You notice the window there? What interesting tidbits of conversation and concern that people had in those faraway days. There's the ceiling of the palm room. Just give you a moment to look at it. And the legend that I've written there basically says the same thing that we've been saying. I'm going to take you now to another magnificent room. This is called the Great Room. This is probably the largest and the most imposing of the staterooms at Spencer House. It was originally intended for the family receptions. It was also used for balls. Note the chandeliers. You can see two. I think there are three in the room. They were made in London. Do you know that company is still there? I imagine if you want to go there and buy one of these chandeliers, if you could afford it, you could get one. What amazes me about so much of this old world information in London is the longevity of companies that existed hundreds of years ago and they're still functioning today. Well, that vendor that made those chandeliers is still in business. This room is used for receptions, used for music recitals, talks of one sort and another. Up in the ceiling of that very room, there are 4 medallions. They are called bronze medallions. I'm not sure that they're bronze, the metal, or whether they are painted bronze, but each one of them depicts some kind of scene from the ancient world. This particular one is showing Bacchus, the god of wine, and Bacchus is being supported by panthers? How can this be? What does this mean? You can see the panthers on each side of the medallion. The house is filled apparently with things of this sort. Another view of the outside of the house. This is just to review it for you. You saw originally from that main facade. Now you can look down the front of it, which I think is the north side, facing on St. James Place, and you get just a little view. I don't have another view of the full front of the house, but it just gives you a view from, I think, an 18th century painting. And here is another room in the house. We're going back inside, and this room is called the Painted Room. The theme of the room is reported to be that of love. And I'm talking here about marital love, and I'm talking about Georgiana and John. They were apparently all of their lives very much in love, their married lives, and so much of the house is dedicated to that concept of love. Look at this, look at the sofas. You see 3 of them there in the paint. Each back on those sofas is curved, and the radius of curvature of the back of each sofa measures the radius of curvature of the walls of the room, so that the sofas can be anywhere in the room and match the walls. I mean, it's a small thing, but little things do count, evidently. Look at the chandelier in that. As I said earlier, many people consider it to be the most beautiful room in all of England, and its theme is devoted to married love. This is one of the little inserts all around that room, all through the ceiling, dedicated to love, and it was a celebration of Lord and Lady Spencer's happy marriage. That you see there is a copy of a Roman painting. As I said, John and Georgiana could buy anything they wanted from the ancient Roman world, and this was one of them. It's interesting that there are 3 characters there, not just 2, but I'll let you make of that what you want to make of it. I'm back again, finally, in this room, to one of the arms of one of those sofas. If you can imagine, I'll try to picture it for you. On the left-hand side, you're looking there at the right end of the sofa. The the humanoid face you see up on top and the golden bar behind it is the arm of the sofa. You can see the fabric of the sofa behind it, both the seat and the back. What do you think of the winged lion as a decorative piece? I don't think any of us would do that today. I don't think any of us would buy such a thing today. In fact, I think most of us would be repelled by something of this sort. But it seemed to be the in thing in English society during the 18th and 19th centuries, and maybe before. Absolutely unbelievable. To my mind, bordering on the hideous, but apparently thought to be beautiful by the people of the time. Well, let's go up the stairs and we go to Lady Spencer's private drawing room. What a room. This is where she received her guests. This is where she would retreat after formal dinners with the ladies to talk about lady things, while the men were down in the other room I showed you earlier, talking about weighty matters. This was her suite. It has a mosaic ceiling, and all the corners and the cornices are, you can see, are decorated with Greek Roman cornices. All of that adapted from the baths of Augusta in Rome. This picture shows you a drawing, actually, of the architectural details in Georgiana's room. These decorations that you see here, which are detailed with measurements by the architect along the right-hand side of the diagram, are exact copies of the columns of the Erechtheum on the Athens Acropolis, as a part of the Acropolis. Maybe some of you have been there. Part of the Acropolis in Athens. There's some protruding porches, and this is from one of those porches using the frieze, F-R-I-E-Z-E, and the ceiling decorations, and they've been adapted for Lady Spencer's drawing room. You can see no expense was too much for the people who lived in this house. This is the library. Interestingly, there was no library in the original house. That surprised me. And it was the second Earl Spencer who took one of the rooms, and that the room he took, this particular room, happened to be the room where John and Georgiana ate all their meals with their family, very seldom resorting to the magnificent dining room that I showed you earlier. This slide. This was their humble dining room. Well, the second Earl Spencer decided he wanted to make an office out of it, and so this became the office to run the vast estates that we were talking about earlier. The library, all right? And this is a so-called ante-room. I was wrong there. This was the original little eating parlor that the family used. The second Earl Spencer dispensed with that and called it the ante-room, which we think was an office. Okay, who were these people today? Well, you see them right there in front of you. The man on the left is the current 9th Earl Spencer, Charles Edward Maurice Spencer. And of course, you all know who, on the right side of the picture, his sister, Diana Spencer, the Princess of Wales. So you see how this all comes around into modern times. She lived there as a child. He lived there as a younger brother. She was senior to him. And of course, we all know the sad story of what happened to Princess Diana and her death in Paris because of an automobile accident. And on the estate that I showed you earlier, there is this marker, a pavilion really. You see it in the distance there. There's a small lake, I call it more a pond, but you can see it in the distance. And what it is, it's engraved, the walls are engraved really with bronze tablets with quotes that her brother Charles Edward Maurice Spencer spoke at her funeral. She is not buried there. Rather, she's buried on a small island in the lake, and you can see the trees on the right side, which are a part of that island. And I'll try to show you the rest of it here. Now you can look directly at the island, and now you can see her grave marker. And then in the same picture, the pavilion I showed you in the previous slide, you can see it in the distance. And so we've come to the end of this talk about the Althorpe estate, which is the home of the current 9th Earl Spencer and was the home of Princess Diana. You can see the family home up in the upper right-hand corner. You can see the lake which you just saw, and the island is kind of masked here. It's very close to the shore, but it's on the right-hand side of that pond-like so-called, quote, lake. That's the burial site. So you get some sense of the estate as it is today, and of course, those hundreds of years ago, it was vast in its making. And so that brings us to the end of this talk. I hope you have enjoyed it and maybe learned something you never knew. Thank you.